Hello, everyone. My name is Sean McLaughlin, and I'm the director of the Basilican Spirituality Center. I'm speaking with you today from my office here in Fox Chase on the monastery grounds. This talk is about the Blessed Mother. Before we start, I want to underscore that everything about Mary points ultimately to her Son. She is never an end within herself. She reflects the radiance of God. Mary wants to lead us to Jesus, not to herself. This is a major misunderstanding that Protestants have of Catholicism. We venerate Mary, but we do not worship her. We worship God alone. When we pray to Mary, we ask that she intercede on our behalf with her Son, because her intercessory power is especially effective. The reason for this efficacy is the closeness between Mary and Jesus. Who knows the Lord better than his own mother? That's the logic of Marian veneration. In this presentation, originally given in June 2020, I will discuss Mary of Nazareth, whom we call the Theotokos, or more commonly, the Blessed Mother. Theotokos is Greek for God-bearer, and this title became a major point of controversy in the 400s, particularly surrounding the Council of Ephesus in 431. In May 2019, I gave the first iteration of what we planned to be an annual talk about Mary, and for that presentation, I focused on 3 questions. First, what can we know about Mary's life? Second, where might she have gone after the resurrection? And third, how has Mary been depicted in sacred art over the centuries? I mention these because some of that material from 2019 will be relevant to this talk. Here are the questions that will frame this talk in 2020. First, what did Marian veneration look like in the ancient church? Second, why is Mary mentioned so many times in the Quran? In fact, she is the only woman named in the Quran. I will outline the answers briefly so that you have them in mind throughout the presentation. With this kind of material, it is helpful to know where you are headed before you get there. Otherwise, the journey can become confusing and we're covering centuries of material. Marian devotion in the ancient church included the following: praying for Mary's intercession with her Son, building churches and shrines dedicated to Mary, making pilgrimages to these churches and shrines, singing hymns to Mary during the Divine Liturgy on Sundays. The Divine Liturgy is another term for the Mass. Annual feasts honoring Mary, including August 15th, which today is the Feast of the Assumption, and using Mary's image in devotional contexts. Now I ask, does that sound familiar? It should, because that's what Catholics do today, all these things. What's even more interesting is that the earliest evidence for Marian devotion and intercession seems to arise from the Christian communities of late Roman Palestine, more specifically Jerusalem. So we see there is this connection between Marian devotion. There's a connection in Marian devotion between late antique Jerusalem and the 21st century. Now, regarding Mary and Islam, this has to do with the religious culture of the Arabian world during late antiquity. Islam, as it was forming, was influenced by Judaism, Christianity, and texts from both traditions. This is evident, for example, in the Quran, where we find stories and other details from Christian texts. Some of the Christian texts that influence the Quran derive from ancient traditions about Mary's life not found in the New Testament. The earliest Islamic community or communities knew these apocryphal stories and details about Mary and valued them, which is why they influenced the Quran. To put it simply, Mary is important to Islam and mentioned so many times in the Quran because the earliest Muslims were familiar with Christian devotion to Mary and to some extent agreed with it. So those are the answers in short. Devotion to Mary in the ancient church is very similar to today. And Islam agreed with ancient Christian devotion to Mary while rejecting the divinity of Christ. Before moving on to the presentation, let us note that it has long been alleged by Protestant and secular scholars that Catholic devotion to Mary is not an ancient phenomenon. They argue it developed in a later historical period, such as the Middle Ages, and is a manifestation of popular religiosity run amok. In fact, this allegation is false. Catholic devotion to Mary is ancient. We find its traces in the New Testament, and then an incredible writing appears in the mid-2nd century called the Protoevangelium of James. By the 4th century, we find just about every kind of reverence Catholics show to the Mother of God today. So again, devotion to Mary is ancient. It's not some later addition to Christianity. Now on to the formal presentation. Okay. Put this down here. So again, this is the 2020 talk of the annual May lecture on the Theotokos. And just as a reminder, Theotokos is Greek for God-bearer. Okay, just to give you some idea of how curious people are about the relationship of Mary to Catholicism, if you were to type into Google, why do Catholics, and then see what the auto-completions are, here are some of the ones that come up. The first one is, why do Catholics pray to Mary? The next that's relevant is, why do Catholics worship Mary? Which of course is a misunderstanding. And then, why do Catholics pray the rosary? Which is related to the topic as well. So this question of why do Catholics worship Mary, which is a misunderstanding, I just want to address that Catholics worship God alone. And historically, there was this etymological distinction between three Greek words. So there's latria, which describes the worship owed to God alone, honoring the first commandment, for example. And then there's dulia, which is the Greek word that describes the honor given to the saints. And finally, hyperdulia, which is the honor given to the Blessed Mother above the other saints. And I think that this approximates roughly to the word veneration. So when I speak of Marian veneration, hyperdulia is probably the closest of these three words to that. It's certainly not latria, which again describes the worship that Catholics give to God alone. So that's the important distinction there. The Catholics worship God alone, they do not worship Mary. Okay, so I stated the main questions before, but I will do so again. The main question for this talk, the first of them is, what did Marian veneration look like in the ancient church? And the second is, why is Mary mentioned so many times in the Quran? Now, I'm drawing primarily from this book, Mary and Early Christian Faith and Devotion by Stephen J. Shoemaker. He is a formidable scholar, and I followed his work for years, and this book is excellent. It's an academic book, so it's not it has not found a large readership among general audiences. It's more for specialists, but I would encourage anyone to read it because it's just extremely well done. The two questions that are framing this talk, what did Marian veneration look like in the ancient church and why is she mentioned so many times in the Quran, they are connected. So let's think about that connection in these main answers. First, ancient Marian veneration closely resembles Catholic practices today. Widespread curiosity about Mary in the ancient world led to various attempts to fill in details about her life not contained in the four Gospels. Many examples survive in Christian Apocrypha. Mary is in the Quran because of when, where, and how Islam formed. Early Islam had a lot of interaction with Christianity, and the earliest Muslims knew the general narrative of the gospel as well as apocryphal stories about Mary and Jesus. Consequently, the Quran contains pieces of gospel texts as well as apocryphal texts. This is a slide I did for our social media. If you don't already follow us on Facebook, I encourage you to do so at Basel Center. And this is a good summary in one slide of this talk. Everything about Mary points ultimately to her Son. She is never an end within herself. She reflects the radiance of God as the moon does the sun. Mary always leads us to Jesus. The Catechism teaches, Mary is truly Mother of God. The Greek word is Theotokos, since she is the mother of the eternal Son of God made man, who is God himself. She carried Jesus in her womb, birthed him, raised him, and stood before him at the foot of the cross. Following the resurrection and ascension, Mary was with the apostles in the upper room in Jerusalem at the beginning of the Catholic Church, which we read in the first chapter of Acts of the Apostles. So I ask, who better to bring us to Christ than his mother? In the middle here, we have the sub tuum praesidium. This is the oldest known prayer requesting Mary's intercession, and it dates to the 200s. And this is the text. We take refuge beneath the protection of your compassion, Theotokos. Do not disregard our prayers in troubling times, but deliver us from danger, O only pure and blessed one. And then just to recap, Marian devotion in the ancient church, I'm somewhat arbitrarily defining ancient as before the year 500. It's not unlike today's devotion that we see among Catholics. People composed texts about Mary's life. People prayed for Mary's intercession with her son. People witnessed apparitions of Mary. Churches and shrines were built in dedication to her. Marian feasts were celebrated annually, including on August 15th, which is now the Assumption. Marian hymns were sung on Sundays during the Divine Liturgy, also known as the Mass. And Mary's image was used in devotional contexts. So again, this slide here, this slide I created for our social media, this pretty much sums up the talk. Okay, let's begin with a timeline. Jesus is born roughly about the year 0, as early as 4 BC, probably closer to 2 BC, sometime, there, we don't know exactly, but, so Mary, I'm guessing, was born maybe 20 years before that, just to give you some sense of approximately where she was born, since we will be talking about a text that discusses the details of her birth. The Gospels were written, scholarly consensus says, roughly between the years 60 and 90. And around the year 150, or in the mid-2nd century, the Protoevangelium of James was written. And this is a very important text, and it's one unlike any other for the period. Then closer to the turn of the 4th century, so right before the year 300, we find the Rylands Papyrus 470, which is the oldest copy of the text of the tuum praesidium, which I read in the previous slide. And finally, in the year 431, the Council of Ephesus took place. This is one of the famous declarations of this council, is that Theotokos is a befitting and accurate name for Mary, Mother of God. And also around that time, the construction was when the construction of the earliest churches dedicated to Mary took place. And I'll mention a couple of those. Okay, so this is the timeline of more or less the first 500 years of Marian history. Okay. What can we know about Mary's life? Well, let's look to the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke Acts. She's the Virgin Mother of Jesus. She was married to Joseph. She lived in Nazareth. Mary visits Elizabeth while she's pregnant. Luke tells us that Elizabeth is her relative. Mary and Joseph accidentally leave Jesus in Jerusalem. And after the resurrection, Mary is in Jerusalem with the 11 apostles and some women and Jesus' brothers. So that's what the Synoptics tell us. From John, we get very little. We get the wedding at Cana and the crucifixion. Those are the only 2 mentions of the Blessed Mother in the Gospel of John. And then in Revelation chapter 12, we also hear about Mary. I'm just going to focus on that, for example, for a moment. Revelation chapter 12, the first 2 verses. Here, this is a painting by Giovanni Gasparo, who's a brilliant painter who's active today. And the verses from Revelation are as follows. A great sign appeared in the sky, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child and wailed aloud in pain as she labored to give birth. So there's the mention of the Blessed Mother in Revelation. All right, so let's look more specifically at the Synoptics for a moment here. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you'll notice that each of the evangelists has a symbol. This also comes from the book of Revelation, but the next time you're in a church or a chapel or in any kind of a Catholic context, take a look to see if you can find these 4 signs. So Matthew is depicted as a man, Mark as a lion, Luke as an ox, and John as an eagle. So for now, we'll just look at the synoptic evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. What the synoptic authors record about Mary indicates 2 things. First, interest in Mary was building quickly in the 1st century. And second, increasing attention to Mary in the synoptics supports the accepted order of composition. So scholarly consensus is on the whole that the order that the synoptic gospels were written in was Mark, Matthew, and then Luke, Acts. And the fact that there is an increasing frequency of mentions of Mary as the gospels progress supports that. So let me give an example. So Mark has only 2 mentions of Mary. In the 3rd chapter of Mark, we have the story of Jesus' true family. It reads as follows. His mother, and notice Mary is not even named. His mother and his brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd seated around him told him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." But he said to them in reply, "Who are my mother and brothers?" And looking around at those seated in the circle, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." The only other mention of Mary in Mark is in the 6th chapter, and this is the rejection at Nazareth. Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? So, very little information for Mark. Matthew includes a little bit more, and Luke adds even more. In fact, Luke Acts, remember, Luke, it's a 2-volume work that Luke wrote. The Gospel is the 1st volume. The Acts of the Apostles is the 2nd volume. And from Luke, we have the earliest Marian hymn in existence, which is the Magnificat. So just a recap of the Marian information in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. She's the Virgin Mother of Jesus. She's married to Joseph. She lived in Nazareth. She visits Elizabeth while she's pregnant. Mary and Joseph accidentally leave Jesus in Jerusalem, and after the resurrection, she is with the 11 apostles and some women and Jesus' brothers. So that's what we get, and most of that comes from Matthew and Luke, because remember, Mark only has those 2 mentions. So the fact that as the first century goes on, Matthew and Luke are adding information about Mary, probably to suit popular demand. All right, now let's look at the Gospel of John. What do we hear about Mary in the Gospel of John? Just 2 things. The wedding at Cana, which is the beginning of the 2nd chapter of John, and then the crucifixion, which is the 19th chapter. And on the left here, we have a depiction of the wedding at Cana by Giotto. And on the right here, we have the crucifixion. Of course, that's Mary and the beloved disciple John at the foot of the cross, Golgotha. Now, John, interestingly, between John and Luke, we have some idea of where Mary might have gone after the resurrection. I mean, we definitely know that she was in Jerusalem, because as Luke tells us in the Acts of the Apostles, when they entered the city, they went to the upper room where they were staying, Peter and John and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas, son of James. All these devoted themselves with one accord to prayer, together with some women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So after the resurrection, she was definitely in Jerusalem. She may also have been in Ephesus, because when we look at John's gospel, we read this in the 19th chapter. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple there whom he loved, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. So since John the Apostle is associated closely with Western Asia Minor, or what we would now call Turkey, the western coast of Turkey, it seems that John and Mary may have been active in that region, specifically Ephesus. And there are some traditions that we have that suggest this. For example, Cyril of Alexandria, who lived about 378 to 444, he alludes to an Ephesus connection with Mary. So she may have gone to Ephesus. It's something that there are traditions about, but we will never know, but it's possible. Okay, something to keep in mind is that unlike today, when people in the ancient world lacked information, they often got creative. Now, this was not to misdirect or fool people, mislead them. It was to satisfy what people wanted to know. So since the New Testament says so little about Mary, later writers elaborated on her life to satisfy popular demand. Okay, I'm not referring to the evangelists. They're drawing from eyewitness testimony. I'm referring to later writers. So we see in apocryphal or dubious Christian texts dating to the 2nd through 5th century, so after the canonical Gospels, we see people getting creative with information about Mary to satisfy popular demand. And just to clarify, the difference between canonical books and apocryphal books is that the canon of the New Testament has 27 books. They are the inspired word of God and were written by eyewitnesses, by those who knew the eyewitnesses, and by authors drawing from eyewitness testimony. In contrast to the canonical books, apocryphal texts lack connections to the eyewitnesses, okay? Thus, they lack authority. And the authors of apocryphal Christian texts show that they feel free to experiment and make things up and deviate from the story as it happened. There are two major examples of apocryphal texts that are relevant for our discussion. Okay, the first is the Protoevangelium of James from the mid-2nd century. I've mentioned this before. And this is what Shoemaker calls the first Marian biography. And the second is the Book of Mary's Repose, which dates to the 3rd century. And this is what Shoemaker calls the earliest narrative of Mary's dormition and assumption. Let's focus on the Protoevangelium of James for a moment. Okay. The Protoevangelium of James tells us the names of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, and evidently Joachim was very wealthy, okay? Now, they are depicted by the Protoevangelium of James as devout and childless, which is clearly a deliberate parallel with Abraham and Sarah. So here's this Old Testament type that the author of the Protoevangelium of James, who is anonymous, it's not James, is mimicking there. And the text indicates that Mary was special from birth. And we see this because Joachim and Anna give Mary over to God in gratitude for her birth. So she's formally attached to the temple. At 6 months old, she walks 7 steps. The number 7 is a common biblical number signifying perfection. At 3 years old, she dances in the temple. And at 12, she's given over to Joseph's care after a sign from God. Now, what the Protoevangelium of James tells us also is that Joseph, at the time, is an old widower with children, and he's initially reluctant to take in Mary. Eventually, he does. So there are 4 details from this text from the mid-2nd century. Again, it's called the Protoevangelium of James. There are 4 details that we now take for granted, and oftentimes we assume that they're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but they're not. So the names of Mary's parents, the fact that Mary sat astride a donkey as she and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem, the fact that Jesus was born in a cave, like a cave being used to hold livestock with a manger and whatnot, and the fact that Joseph is much older than Mary. These 4 things come from the Protoevangelium of James and not from the canonical Gospels. Now, there's nothing intrinsically problematic or impossible about these 4 facts, but they're guesses or possible examples of tradition, but they're not definite because they don't come from the inspired Gospels. Here's a depiction of the death of Joseph by Giovanni Gasparo. And here we see Joseph is clearly much older than the Blessed Mother. That detail, again, from the Protoevangelium of James, there's no indication of that from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Again, there's nothing intrinsically problematic or impossible about it, but it's just interesting to think that this is a detail that has been handed down for centuries that we don't know for sure. It's a suggestion. It's entirely possible, but we don't know it for sure. So let's assess the Protoevangelium of James for a moment. It emphasizes the virgin birth and righteousness as well as purity of Mary and Joseph. Wants to satisfy questions left unanswered by the New Testament, such as, what was Mary's life like before the Nativity? How did Joseph react when he found out Mary was pregnant? Can we be sure Mary was a virgin? And how do we explain Jesus' brothers and sisters? So these 4 questions, you can imagine audiences asking these over the centuries, and they were asking them as early as the 1st and 2nd centuries. So the Protoevangelium of James is designed to answer the questions left unanswered by the New Testament, okay? It was very influential, and it probably inspired the oldest extant image of Mary. Now, we don't know if this text includes authentic material, but if any apocryphal writing includes authentic material about the life of Mary, this would be it. But unfortunately, we will be forever speculating. Okay, so this is the oldest extant, probably the oldest extant image of the Blessed Mother, of Mary, okay? Fittingly, it is found in the oldest known church, which is the Europos church found in eastern Syria, which dates in the middle, it's about the middle of the 3rd century. Now, it's kind of hard to make out, so here's the same image with more contrast. And you can see a woman here with a pail. She's fetching water. It's difficult to make out, but there's also a star over her stomach. And so this is a scene from an apocryphal text. So it's not found in the canonical Gospels, but from the Protoevangelium of James. Here's a map to show you some geographical context. So the events of the crucifixion, death, resurrection of Christ in Jerusalem here in the Holy Land. Up here is Ephesus. So this is possibly where John the Apostle and Mary were. It's possible, it's not definite, but there's nothing intrinsically unlikely about it. And then here is Europos. So that third location in eastern Syria, that is where the oldest known church is, as well as the oldest, probably the oldest extant image of the Blessed Mother. Okay, so all there in the Eastern Mediterranean. All right, now let's speak about ancient Marian veneration. There are different forms of ancient Marian veneration. First, we have biographical stories written to compensate for the paucity of detail about her in the New Testament. Okay, for this, the Protoevangelium of James is the archetype. Another form of ancient Marian veneration would be liturgical, especially in Jerusalem. So the forms or the subforms of these would be hymns and prayers. Next, we have shrines and churches dedicated to her. We have material culture as well. So pilgrimage art, including ampullae, which are like small flasks, pilgrimage tokens, and lamps from Palestine that invoke the Virgin's blessings. And again, this is from Shoemaker's work. Annual feasts, annual liturgical feasts were another form of ancient Marian veneration, including the 15th of August, which today is the Feast of the Assumption. And then images of Mary used in devotional contexts too. Lastly, and I find this to be the most interesting, another form of Marian veneration that's ancient is parents naming their daughters Mary. For example, in Egypt during the 300s. So today we have Mary, Maria, Molly, various forms of Mary that parents name their daughters. Well, we had the same thing in ancient times as well. The Sub Tuum Praesidium, I mentioned this text before. This is the oldest known prayer asking Mary's intercession. Now, this piece of papyrus on the left of the screen, this is the oldest known copy, but the prayer is older than this piece of papyrus, but this is the oldest known manuscript we have. It dates to about somewhere between 275 and 300, and it may have been used as an amulet, like someone would have written the prayer and folded up this piece of papyrus and worn it as a necklace. And the translation is, "We take refuge beneath the protection of your compassion, Theotokos. Do not disregard our prayers in troubling times, but deliver us from danger, O only pure and blessed one." Let's look at some liturgical veneration. In the mid-2nd century, there's a collection of early Christian hymns, and these mention Mary. In the mid-4th century, we see what is likely the earliest witness to liturgical commemorations of the Virgin in the form of 3 annual liturgical feasts celebrated in her honor. And then in the late 4th or early 5th centuries, we see a corpus of hymns, and there is ample evidence of that Mary's intercessions were regularly sought during the Sunday worship of the Jerusalem church. So I mentioned before this connection between ancient Marian veneration in Jerusalem and the 21st century. So here's a specific example, the Jerusalem Georgian Chant Book. So all this is to say is that there were various forms of liturgical veneration of the Blessed Mother in the ancient church, much like we see today. All right. 2 of the earliest examples. Well, let's see. Marian apparitions are well known today. We could think of Fatima, Lourdes, Guadalupe. While the earliest record of a Marian apparition was written by Gregory of Nyssa. Okay, he wrote this in the fall of 380. He himself was not the witness, but he was recording the fact that there was an apparition of the Blessed Mother. And Gregory of Nyssa is the younger brother of Saints Basil and Macrina. And he was bishop of the See of Nyssa. Now, probably the oldest known church dedicated to Mary is the Church of the Kathisma, or seat of the Theotokos. And this dates to the late 4th or early 5th century. It's located about halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. According to tradition, it stands on the spot where the Virgin sat to rest briefly before giving birth in a nearby cave. We see that story of Jesus being born in a cave in the Protoevangelium of James. And the main focus of this church was a large rock upon which the Blessed Mother was thought to have sat. So those are two of the earliest examples, the earliest example of a Marian apparition and the earliest example of a church dedicated to Mary. Unfortunately, the Church of the Kathisma, there's very little left. We just have sort of the footprint of the building, but you can see this today if you were to go to the Holy Land, again, about halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. That's what's left of the Church of the Kathisma. Fortunately, there's a little more of the Church of Mary in Ephesus in what is today Turkey. This was built a little bit before the year 431 when the Council of Ephesus took place. So we could see some of the columns and walls still standing. And this is the Basilica of Mary Major. This was built roughly between 422 and 434. It was consecrated in 434. And there have been a number of later additions, but on the inside, if you look at the mosaics that run along the nave, these are very, very early, so 5th century mosaics. And it's amazing to think that in this church, this is the church where St. Ignatius Loyola celebrated his first Mass. And I just love the idea that when we look at these mosaics today, we're looking at the same ones that people looked at since the 400s. So there's an amazing connection to Catholics living in late antiquity there. And this is in Rome. Okay, let's look at several of the oldest extant images of Mary. Now, I mentioned before, the oldest one is probably this one inspired by the Protoevangelium of James, Mary fetching water with her pail in eastern Syria from the 200s. But this is another one that's pretty close in date. This is the Madonna found in the catacomb of Priscilla in Rome. This is from the 3rd century. I highlight her with this triangle because it's kind of difficult to make out, but you can sort of see Mary holding Jesus as a baby there. Now this one is especially remarkable because it also has one of the oldest depictions of the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So this is the loculus, or the niche tomb of a young girl by the name of Severa. It dates to right around the turn of the 4th century, or somewhere between 275 and 325. And it says in Latin there on the left, first of all, there's this girl Severa, she's depicted there, and it says, Severa in Deo vivas, or Severa live in God, or Severa lives in God. And on the right, we see the gold, frankincense, and myrrh being offered to Mary, who's seated there holding the baby Jesus. There is the star over top of them, and behind them is prophetic, an Old Testament messianic prophecy. Lastly, this is the icon known as the Salus Populi Romani. This may be the oldest Marian icon. It's supposed to date to shortly before the turn of the 7th century. Although, like many famous icons, it's probably been painted over multiple times. But in any event, it's held in the Basilica of Mary Major, which we just looked at. And Pope Francis recently venerated this icon in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it may be the oldest Marian icon. If it's not the oldest, it's one of the most famous and still can be seen today in the Basilica of Mary Major in Rome. All right. Now, let's speak about Mary and the Quran. The Quran is the sacred text of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, it was revealed to Muhammad between 610 and 632. Okay, so here we have the Eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula, and Muhammad was born in Mecca, and he was active in Mecca and Medina, which I highlight here. And the interesting thing about Mary in Islam is that she's the only woman mentioned in the Quran. And in fact, the Quran mentions Mary more than the New Testament. So let that sink in. The Quran mentions Mary more than the New Testament. The Quran draws from Christian Apocrypha, for example, like in Surah 19, the Nativity described in Surah 19. And the presence of Mary in the Quran addresses popular demand for more information about her, much like Christian texts. So let's look at some examples of Mary in the Quran. Okay, so the Annunciation that we get from the Gospel of Luke, there are two versions of that in the Quran. First in Surah 3, which is the surah titled The Family of Imran. Imran is probably Amram, who's the father of Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. And also in Surah 19, which is the Mariam surah. So there's an entire chapter of the Quran. Surah roughly translates to chapter. So Surah 19 is called the Mariam surah. It's all about Mary. So we see the Annunciation in Surahs 3 and 19. But something else very interesting that there is a late second century apocryphal work called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and this also appears in the Quran. So this is Jesus rather than Mary, but I still think it's interesting that in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is a child. He makes birds out of clay, and then he animates them. They become real. And we see this text clearly influence the Quran because in Surah 3, it reads, "And make him a messenger to the children of Israel, who will say, Indeed, I have come to you with a sign from your Lord in that I design for you from clay that which is like the form of a bird. Then I breathe into it, and it becomes a bird by permission of Allah." So these are examples, the first two of Luke's Annunciation, versions of that found in the Quran. And then in the second example, we have that this apocryphal text, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, influenced the Quran as well in Surah 3. For a little more detail, if we compare the first chapter of Luke to Surahs 3 and 19, you can see the influence. So read from left to right. That's why I have that arrow there. For example, you can see in Luke chapter 1, verse 18. So right in the middle there. "Then Zechariah said to the angel, 'How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years.'" Well, look at Surah 3, verse 40. "He said, 'My Lord, how will I have a boy when I have reached old age and my wife is barren?'" Or also Surah 19, verse 8. "He said, 'My Lord, how will I have a boy when my wife has been barren and I have reached extreme old age?'" So you can see, again, moving from Luke to the Quran, Surahs 3 and 19, that the gospel influenced the Quran. And these are just some of the examples. There are many more, but it would just to give you an idea of some of these. So I have highlighted in bold what is common between the gospel and two surahs from the Quran. All right, so let's assess Mary in the Quran. Mary's prevalence in the Quran shows that early Islam was familiar with the canonical Gospels and Christian Apocrypha. Her presence suggests a lot about the strength of Christian veneration of Mary during Islam's earliest days. And incipient Islam agreed with Christian veneration of Mary to an extent, okay, which is why we find Mary in the Quran. All right, some conclusions. Let's do a quick recap of Marian attributes. So the oldest known hymn is the Magnificat, which is found in the first chapter of Luke. That dates roughly somewhere between the 60s and the 80s. The oldest biography of Mary is the Protoevangelium of James. That's how Shoemaker describes the Protoevangelium of James, the oldest Marian biography. That dates to the mid-2nd century. The oldest known prayer is the tuum praesidium. That dates to the 3rd century. I should say the oldest known prayer seeking her intercession, because the Magnificat in a way is also a prayer. The oldest known image, or what is probably the oldest known image, is the Annunciation scene from Dur Europos. That dates to before the year 256. And finally, the oldest known Marian churches, the Church of the Kathisma, or the seat of the Theotokos, is somewhere about the year 400. The Church of Mary in Ephesus dates before the Council of Ephesus, so before the year 431. And then the Basilica of Mary Major in Rome dates about 422 to 432, somewhere in there. All right. Just a reminder in these conclusions that we only know for sure what scripture and tradition tell us of Mary. So we know that she was immaculately conceived, wedded to Joseph, a virgin at Jesus' birth and for her whole life. a witness to the resurrection, and she was assumed body and soul into heaven. We also know that Mary was in Jerusalem after the resurrection, and she may have been in Ephesus with John the Apostle, but that the latter part of that is, we don't know, it's speculation. Why is there apocryphal content about Jesus and Mary in the Quran? Well, the earliest Muslims and Christians with whom they interacted knew these stories and valued them. So the prevalence of apocryphal writings demonstrates that people have always wanted to know more about Mary than the Gospels tell. And popular demand for details about Mary's life was so widespread, it even affected early Islam. Increasing interest in Mary is evident through the Gospels. In particular, Luke and John sowed many of the seeds that would eventually grow into the cult of the Virgin during late antiquity. Later apocryphal writers from the 2nd through the 5th centuries elaborate on Mary's life, and the best example of this, the archetype, is the Protoevangelium of James. And finally, the last slide here, I'd like to close with the Memorare. This is a prayer to Mary that became popular in the early modern period, and it remains so today, and it goes as the following. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thine intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, I fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear me and answer me. Amen.